Hello, I've got my film tech hat on today with some observations on film restoration and mastering, specifically the journey from an SDR photochemical source into the 4K UHD HDR domain. So I'm here in DaVinci Resolve, where I've lined up pairs of the same clips, one in high dynamic range and its standard dynamic range counterpart sitting side by side on an HDR timeline. I'm actually screen recording this in HDR, so if you can watch this in HDR, you'll actually see the changes yourself, albeit only in the timeline viewer here, not on a reference monitor, I'm afraid. If you are watching in SDR, keep an eye on the various scopes and measuring tools, and you'll see the data changes, if not the visuals, to support my observations. So I've prepared this demo to try to demonstrate and analyze an effect I find quite visually disruptive. This can be observed in films shot using the photochemical process that have recently undergone some sort of restoration, possibly a rescan of the original negative, likely into Ultra HD and its sister technologies, high dynamic range and wide color gamut. That would include a vast catalogue of titles made prior to the demise of the photochemical process that began in the late 1990s. So first up on the timeline, we have the film Funny Girl, photographed in 1968 by the heavyweight Hollywood DP Harry Stradling. And here, by way of a contrast, we have Furiosa, a Mad Max saga from 2024, DP Simon Duggan. Both DPs have used their considerable skills and the technology of the day to create striking, memorable images that work hard in the service of the story. Coincidentally, as I was preparing this, I realized that both stories are about strong, feisty young women bending the world to their own wills. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm setting aside the wide color gamut side of the HDR equation to focus purely on the luminance values, so the increased dynamic range of display brightness that HDR offers. The effect is obvious if we A and B the clips between SDR and HDR here. So let's choose a couple. So here we have the HDR clip, and here we have the SDR clip. So only the upper parts of the signal expand upwards, maybe with a slight drop in blacks. You can also see the values on the waveform here reflect these changes. And let me just bring up the waveform a bit. So let's just do that again. HDR. You can see that the peaks here of the signal, the upper parts of the signal, are reaching into the 400 nit level. So certainly into HDR territory there. Going back to SDR, we can see that the peaks are restricted to the 100 nit cap for SDR. So far, no surprises. We expect to see these differences going from SDR into HDR. But alongside this increase in highlight brightness, I'm experiencing something else, more disruptive and profound. I call this phenomenon lifting the veil. Let me try to explain what I'm seeing and feeling. In the HDR version of the shots, I feel like a spell has been broken, and I'm somehow taken out of the story, and I'm suddenly conscious of the artifice of it all. I imagine the crew gathered behind the camera, and I can feel the heat of the lamps. Unfortunately, once experienced, it becomes hard to ignore this veil lifting effect in other photochemical shot SDR to HDR transfers. If you've ever walked onto a lit film set, you'll have experienced something similar firsthand. To the naked eye, the film lights look unnaturally harsh and bright. This was especially so in the days of the photochemical process, when film emulsions were less sensitive to light. But the DPs knew from experience that what looked bright, even brash lighting to the naked eye, would be ameliorated by the negative and subsequent printing processes into the images we finally read as reality in the dimness of the cinema. Back in the day, a favourite DP's trick was to half shut your eyes when assessing the lit set, so that you're essentially looking through your eyelashes. This was a quick and dirty way to mimic the effect of the shadow crushing and highlight roll-off that would take place along the negative and printing chain. This revealing of the on-set version of the lighting is what I believe we run the danger of exposing when we transition this type of photochemical photography into the HDR domain and start pushing the values around without thought and purpose. Let's examine what technical ingredients, beyond the color grading itself, may be contributing to this disruptive effect. Let's use this example here, this two-shot from Funny Girl. Let's examine the style, technique, and the lighting tools used, because they may provide us with clues. So first off, artificial versus natural light. I'm seeing the effect more clearly. It seems more distracting for scenes that are predominantly lit with artificial light, with interiors and sets most susceptible here. Exteriors with natural light seem to fare better, so compare this shot here with this shot here. These are both HDR. So HDR, SDR, HDR, SDR. Quality of light, soft versus hard. The use of focusing Fresnel lighting fixtures and hard light in general was much more popular up to the late 1970s. I observe that the lifting the veil effect is much more pronounced when these fixtures are used. The edges of the focused beams are becoming more visible in the HDR grades. High versus low-key lighting. Is this veil lifting effect more pronounced with different lighting styles? So these extreme low-key examples and let's choose a sort of fairly extreme high-key example. Again, another low-key example. SDR, HDR, HDR, SDR. Back to this one. HDR, SDR, HDR. And finally, HDR, SDR. So I'd say looking at these examples, the extreme high-key lighting seems more immune from the effect, as do the ultra-low-key examples. I'm kept deeper in the story here. The veil lift appears to me at its most pronounced somewhere in the middle, in the sort of mid-key area, if such a thing exists. So for example, this shot, it's not ultra-low-key, it's not ultra-high-key, it's somewhere in the middle. Light modifiers and spill control. The technique of flagging bright lights, so that's physically occluding parts of the set from a light's output, can create areas of strong contrast. So you can see these areas here, where the light has actually been flagged off the background. Injudicious ramping of the luminance values in HDR can draw unwanted attention to these areas of transitions in luminance values. Lighting ratios. The difference between two or more sources of light striking a surface can be described as a lighting ratio, the difference measured in stops of light and resulting key to fill ratios, so 1:1, 2:1, 4:1, for example. By manipulating the values to extremes in HDR, these ratios are in effect being distorted, altering the light ratios calculated by the DP for crucial parts of the frame, such as the face. Subprime sources. In this example, in the HDR and SDR versions, looking at the grain structure in this shot, it's possible that this has been drawn from a lower quality source than the others. Possibly all that was left was a dupe or even a release print. I'm seeing that lower quality sources may show the veil lift effect in a more pronounced way. The finesse of lighting. The bottom line may be that the ability of a shot to translate intact, possibly refined, into the HDR domain is related to the degree of its finesse. I've seen plenty of examples of budget 1960s and 70s films, clearly lit in a hurry, that have not fared well when their veil is lifted in HDR. I'll state here that I think the Funny Girl restoration colorist David H. Bernstein has struck just the right balance with the Funny Girl project, sensitive to the nuances and subtleties of Stradlin's original photography. The phenomenon we've explored seems to be peculiar only to the photochemical shot SDR to HDR process. The end-to-end HDR pipeline, where productions are conceived and delivered in HDR, appears immune. Hence, I think we can safely A and B the shots from Furiosa between SDR and HDR without experiencing the lifting the veil syndrome. HDR, SDR. HDR, SDR. HDR, SDR. So where to from here? What conclusions can we draw? Here I'd like to offer a practical example of how a simple adjustment in the grade might offset this veil lift effect. So let's select this shot here. It's not ultra low key, it's not ultra high key, it's somewhere stuck in the middle, and as such a casualty of this veil lifting effect. So I've prepared a very slight adjustment here to try and offset this veil lift effect. So let me just apply this. Let me just toggle it on and off. The fix, as it were, there is off, fix on, fix off, fix on. What I've done here is to go into the HDR tools in DaVinci Resolve and just try and find the light value that I feel is responsible the most for this lifting of the veil effect. With these tools, it's really very, very easy to use these masks here that the tools provide to see what part of the luminance values are sort of responsible for the jarring effect. And in this particular one, if I just click that palette open and that expands, it shows us here on this graph where these values are lying. And I discovered that in this particular value, this is where I made my adjustment. So you can see that all I did was basically just drop the value here in exposure. If I raise it back up again, you can see those values popping out again. Take it back down. And so for me, they sit back now, those values, into the scene in a way that doesn't take me out of the story experience. So now A and B between HDR and SDR to me isn't quite so jarring. Looking at the scopes again, we still have the peaks, the very, very high parts of the signal, certainly the speculars here in the incandescent light filaments here, are still up in the HDR values. So we're not losing those very, very tops. But these areas here, where the focused light is hitting the set, I think have just been knocked back sufficiently for them not to leap out at the eye. All this, of course, subjective, but I think worthy of attention and consideration. So, to sum up, Back in the early 2000s, when the increase in spatial resolution from standard definition to high definition shone an unforgiving light on sets, costume, and talent, workflows had to adapt. Now, as we transition into the HDR domain, I believe this lifting the veil on photochemical photography requires those in charge of these restoration projects to first be aware of the existence of the phenomenon, and subsequently to develop guiding principles, solutions that become best practice, and in time, possibly agreed technical standards, to which these restoration projects should adhere. The antiques market has long shifted to preferring, actually assigning a higher value to, items whose patina of age is left intact, over those that have been subjected to a well-meaning but fatal wipe of Brasso or spray of Mr. Sheen. Could there be an argument for treating film restoration in a similar way? What might these guiding principles look like? Well, they could be formed by undergoing a thorough research of the techniques, tools, and equipment used in the original film. This could include cameras, lenses, lighting styles, fixtures, and light modifiers of the time. The underlying aesthetic of the original photography should be discussed, understood, and preserved. Projects whose photography is less finessed should be treated with even more care when moved into the HDR domain. In spite of the foregoing, the colorist may still be caught between the desire to preserve the sensitivities and creative intent of the original photography and the current producer's wish to justify the new release commercially. When under pressure to make it brighter, the colorist could create pause for thought and discussion by tactfully exploring whether the suggested adjustment might take us deeper into or out of the story. Surely this is an important criteria for any creative or technical decision. If you've stuck around to the end of the video, thanks for watching, and I hope it's provided some food for thought.